Hello and welcome to my seminar. Today I will be discussing isolation as well as its definitions, different ways people can be isolated, positive and negative effects of isolation, and finally analyzing where isolation was found in The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. Feeling alone and isolated from others is something we all experience whether or not it meets the literal definition of alone. Feeling alone or isolated from others can have literal and figurative meanings which are very different from each other. Isolation, according to Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, is medically defined as a segregation of a group of organisms from related forms in such a manner as to prevent crossing. Another medical definition provided by Webster is a psychological defense mechanism consisting of the separation of ideas or memories from the emotions connected with them. A final, more literal definition is the state of being in a place or situation that is separated from others. All definitions are correct, even if they are very different from each other, but none are any less important than another. Isolation can be divided into two different categories, literal and figurative. Isolation, in the literal sense, it will be discussed, is the physical separation of things relative to each other. Figuratively, it will be discussed as the idea of the feeling of isolation, even if you're not physically separated from something. Both of these categories of isolation can be further split into positive and negative effects of isolation. This all will be used to analyze The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, and its use of literal and figurative isolation as well as the positives and negatives of both. Before we can analyze The Old Man and the Sea, we must first understand what isolation is. As mentioned, there are two kinds of isolation, figurative and literal. It can be as small as a timeout where you're placed 10 feet away from anyone else, but as little as that may be, the effects of isolation are still present as you are not able to interact with what you see, either being others or toys. On the other extreme, solitary confinement is another form of isolation as you have no one to talk to and nothing to stimulate your brain. And as mentioned in the outline of this assignment, it is considered one of the worst behavior correcting actions a court can award a criminal convicted of a crime, with the only exception being death. Figuratively is much different, as you may be surrounded by people or things, but mentally you could feel like you're unable to interact with them even though there is nothing physically stopping you. An example of this would be going to a different country where you don't know anyone, and they might even speak a different language than you do. Even if they did speak the same language, it is still difficult to interact with them as they are strangers to you just as you are to them, and no trust has been made and no relationship is there to prompt a conversation. Even if the issues stopping you from talking to other people have been resolved, you can still feel isolated. An example of this could be a party where you know everyone, you've talked to everyone at some point, and you speak the same language. But for introverted people, this can still leave them feeling alone with no one to talk to, as they may feel a lack of self-confidence and feel uncomfortable with the situation. Oftentimes, when being faced with isolation, we try to think of ways to escape the feeling of it by distracting ourselves in any way we can. Often, many people's first thought is to pull out their phones as the device is familiar and we seek comfort in them. When our phones aren't an option, we seek stimulation in other things like our own bodies or our thoughts. But at a certain point of isolation without any forms of external stimulation, we slowly drive ourselves into a state of insanity, and that is why it is such a harsh form of punishment in prisons. Isolation certainly comes with its positive and negative effects, but most commonly analyzed by its negative effects, as it is essentially putting the mind against itself, which is one of the most dangerous things a person can do. Some extroverted people fear isolation as they feel the need to be around others all the time, but others thrive in isolation from others. There's one thing that is the same for everyone though, and that is that complete isolation from any forms of stimuli will lead a person into insanity after long enough periods of time. Isolation may be almost purely a mental battle, but there is also many physical problems that can be linked to this. Extreme isolation can lead the body into fight or flight response, which can lead to increased stress levels, which leads to lots of other problems, including reduced sleep quality, as well as many problems with the heart, including high blood pressure. Loneliness can also lead to depression and anxiety, which can be linked to the same problems. Creatively, isolation can have negative effects as it may lead us to get stuck on ideas, leaving us to become more stressed out when an answer cannot be found. This can lead us to becoming overwhelmed and giving up. which can lead to a feeling of incompleteness and disappointment in ourselves. Along with this, without the input of others, we are unable to gauge where we stand on different things, because oftentimes we find it useful to have others tell us when we are doing things well or not, and the lack of feedback may cause us to feel anxious and unsure of ourselves. Just one of the other ways our mind can drive itself crazy after long enough periods of time. Isolation, along with all its negative effects and consequences, can have positive effects as well, mainly for people who are introverted. It gives them the ability to recharge and think about things they want/need to think about. Being alone for some people is also more comfortable, as they don't feel the need to worry about external things such as what other people think of them. Another positive aspect of isolation is that it gives the person the ability to think creatively and limits distractions from other things. Thinking creatively is a large part of isolation, as it is usually the factor causing people to drive themselves crazy after a long enough period of time. You're forced to think creatively in complete isolation, as there is no external factors providing ideas for you. Another large benefit of isolation is that there is no other physical distractions except for those in which you want. The only distractions, again, are those created by the mind itself, which can lead you to going down rabbit holes of thought. But if done properly, isolation can have large positive benefits, as it can boost creativity and reduce distractions significantly. Isolation also is useful in helping people to discover hidden strengths they never previously thought possible, as they are alone without the input of others. Without the fear of judgment of other people, we allow ourselves to do things that we wouldn't otherwise do. Another thing we may be forced to do in isolation is test our limits, as there is no one to be a safety net for us if something goes wrong. This can lead to total determination, which many people strive to achieve in certain activities, and the feeling that they did everything they possibly could, which leads to a feeling of completeness of a task. Now that we understand isolation and its positive and negative effects, we can pick out isolation in the book The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. An example of physical isolation in the book The Old Man and the Sea is when Santiago is physically at sea away from everyone else. This is a very simple yet effective example of how Santiago is isolated from people, as even if Santiago wanted to, there is no way for him to contact with anyone else. This has an effect on him, as he struggles greatly with the fish, and help from someone else would have been very useful to him, as he was alone, but as an old man with limited strength. An example of figurative isolation in The Old Man and the Sea would be how Santiago lives his daily life. Even though Santiago sees people on a somewhat regular basis, with the absence of his wife, it appears that Santiago feels alone and almost lost without her, and that he needs to strive for purpose in his life, which is why he wants to battle to find the largest and best fish he can. Isolation for Santiago did come with some positive effects, as during the fight against the fish, he was able to commit to being solely focused on the task at hand, as he realized that it was going to be a fight to the death between him and the fish, and he knew that he was ready to die as long as he knew he put everything he had into the fight. This positive isolation led him to emerge from the battle victorious, leaving him feeling complete and fulfilled with himself. Isolation in Santiago's life wasn't exclusively positive, though. There were some negative that were implied he faced daily, most notably the absence of his wife. It seemed as though Santiago struggled every day, but always tried his best to hide it from everyone else. I think this is a large part of what led him to physically decay, as he didn't have much of a reason to maintain his physical health over time, as well as his wife not allowing them to be able to take care of each other as they grew old together. It is clear that, as mentioned before, some negative effects like depression were present in Santiago, as it appeared that he accepted defeat on a daily basis, having not caught anything in over 80 days, as well as not having anyone to come back home to. This figurative isolation caused Santiago to slowly decay mentally, as less and less things in his life brought him meaning and purpose. As we saw in The Old Man and the Sea, isolation can have positive and negative effects for Santiago, as when he was alone fishing, he was able to put his mind to complete the task, and ultimately it paid off for him. But on the other hand, we also saw how loneliness slowly destroyed him, as the absence of his wife left him to be depressed and without anyone. As mentioned, there are positive effects of isolation, such as the ability to completely focus all our attention and energy on one specific task. It can also be noted, though, that there are many more negative effects, and the causes of them are different for everyone in every different situation.